Sometimes family can be crueler than any winter storm. When 60-year-old Elias Thorne was thrown off his own family land by his greedy nephew, he had nowhere to go but the snowy mountains, with only his faithful donkey by his side. The nephew called him a useless burden, not worth feeding through the cold months ahead. So Elias set out to find his great-aunt Martha's place, a woman the family had written off as dead, her home nothing more than a forgotten shack in the wilderness. But when Elias finally reached those coordinates, what he found waiting in the pines changed everything. What could a shunned old woman possibly leave behind that would turn a cast-out cowboy's life completely around? Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. The barn smelled of hay and old leather, scents that had been part of Elias Thorne's life for as long as he could remember. He moved slowly in the pre-dawn darkness, his weathered hands folding the worn red saddle blanket that had covered Barnaby's back for more years than he cared to count. The blanket was faded now, its crimson threads turned to rust and pink, but he could still see Clara's careful stitches along the edges where she'd sewn it together 40 winters ago. Clara. Even now, 5 years after losing her, the thought of his wife brought a tightness to his chest that had nothing to do with age or the cold mountain air. She'd made this blanket in the first year of their marriage, sitting by the fire in the evenings while he repaired tack and told her stories about the horses he'd known. She'd laughed at his tales, her needle never pausing, creating something beautiful and practical all at once. He laid the blanket across Barnaby's back now, smoothing it with gentle strokes. The donkey turned his long head to look at him with those knowing brown eyes, ears forward, patient as always. "Just you and me now, old friend," Elias said quietly. The homestead around him was silent, but it wasn't the peaceful silence he'd known all his life. This was the silence of ending, of a door closing that would never open again. Through the barn's open door, he could see the main house, its windows dark, except for one upstairs room where his nephew, Raymond, no doubt slept soundly, unburdened by conscience or second thoughts. Elias had built this barn himself, 35 years back, when he and Clara first took over the homestead from his parents. Every board, every nail, every careful measurement had been his. He'd raised the roof beams with his father and 2 neighbors who'd since passed on. He'd painted it barn red with Clara directing him from below, calling up suggestions about spots he'd missed. Their son, Michael, had taken his first steps in the dusty corridor between the stalls. Michael. Another loss, though different from Clara's. His boy had left for the city 20 years ago, chasing opportunities that didn't exist in these mountains. He called twice a year now, on Elias's birthday and Christmas, their conversations growing shorter and more distant with each passing season. Michael had his own life, his own family, that Elias had met only once. That was the way of things, he supposed. Children grew and went their own ways. But this homestead had always been here, solid and unchanging, a place he thought he'd die in one day, peacefully, in the bed where Clara had passed. That dream had died yesterday afternoon, when Raymond had cornered him in this very barn. His nephew had changed over the years. The boy who'd spent summers here, learning to ride and helping with the hay harvest, had grown into a cold-eyed man of 35, with a calculating nature that reminded Elias of nothing so much as a banker tallying debts. Raymond's father, Elias's younger brother Thomas, had died 8 years back, leaving the adjacent property to his only son. Thomas had been different from Raymond, warm and generous, though perhaps not as shrewd in business as he might have been. When Thomas passed, Raymond inherited not just land, but also his father's debts, and those debts had apparently taught the young man to value money above all else. "Uncle Elias," Raymond had said yesterday, stepping into the barn with his boots clicking on the wooden floor. He wore city clothes even out here, pressed trousers and a wool coat that looked expensive. "We need to talk about the situation." "The situation?" As if 40 years of Elias's life on this land could be reduced to a situation. "What's on your mind, Raymond?" Elias had been mucking out the stalls, work that kept his hands busy and his back strong, despite his 60 years. "Winter's coming hard this year. Weather reports say it'll be the worst in a decade." Raymond had leaned against a post, careful not to dirty his coat. "I've been going over the numbers, and the truth is, we can't afford to support everyone through the lean months." Elias had stopped working then, leaning on his pitchfork, feeling the first stirrings of understanding in his gut. "Support everyone? You don't contribute much anymore, Uncle. I don't mean that unkindly, but it's a fact. You're past the age for heavy work, and this place needs to be run efficiently if it's going to survive." "I've worked this land for 40 years, boy." Elias kept his voice level, though anger was beginning to warm his chest. "Built half these buildings with my own hands, and I'm grateful for that. Truly." Raymond's tone suggested anything but gratitude. "But this is business. I've taken over management of both properties since Dad passed, and I have to make hard decisions. We can't support useless mouths, Uncle. Not through a winter like this one." Useless mouths. The phrase had hit Elias like a physical blow. "You're telling me to leave?" "I'm telling you the reality of our situation. There's no profit in sentiment." Raymond had straightened then, all pretense of familial warmth dropping away. "I need you gone by morning. You can take the donkey. I'll give you that much. This is my home. Actually, when Mom and Dad passed, the deed transferred to me as the last direct heir. You've been living here on family goodwill, Uncle. That goodwill has run out." Raymond had turned toward the door, then paused. "You have until dawn. I'd suggest you start packing." Standing now in that same barn, hours later, Elias felt the weight of those words settle over him again. He'd spent the night gathering what little he could carry, the saddle blanket, some dried food, a bedroll, his winter coat and hat, a few tools. Everything that had made up his life fit into 2 saddlebags and a pack that Barnaby could carry. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades building a life, only to have it reduced to what a single donkey could bear. He secured the last of his belongings to Barnaby's pack saddle, his fingers working automatically through tasks he'd performed thousands of times. The donkey stood patient, understanding in his own way that something significant was happening. Barnaby had been with Elias for 12 years, a gift from Clara, who'd insisted they needed something more economical than horses in their retirement years. The donkey had proven her right, steady and sure-footed, requiring little and giving much. "Where we're going, I don't rightly know if we'll be welcome," Elias told the animal, stroking his neck. "But it's the only place I can think of." The place was Great-Aunt Martha's property, up in the high mountains. Martha had been his grandmother's sister, a woman who'd lived well into her 90s, according to family legend, though no one had seen her in more than 30 years. The family had declared her dead without proof, more out of convenience than certainty. Her property, somewhere up in the remote peaks, had been written off as worthless, probably fallen into ruin. But Elias remembered the coordinates. His grandmother had made him memorize them when he was a boy, making him repeat them until he had them fixed in his mind. "Martha's place," his grandmother had said, "in case you ever need it. She'd want family to know they had somewhere to go." That had been more than 50 years ago, but the numbers remained clear in his memory. He'd never had cause to use them, never thought he would. Now they represented his only option. He led Barnaby out of the barn, the donkey's hooves clopping softly on the frozen ground. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, pale grey spreading across the horizon. Snow covered everything, a fresh fall from 2 nights ago that lay pristine and unmarked. More was coming. He could feel it in the air, that particular heaviness that promised a storm. The homestead looked peaceful in the early light. The house where he'd raised his son, the barn he'd built, the fences he'd mended 100 times, the fields where he'd worked through heat and cold and everything between. all of it bathed in that soft pre-dawn glow that made everything seem gentle and forgiving. But there was no forgiveness here. Raymond had made that clear. Elias mounted Barnaby, settling into the familiar saddle. The donkey shifted under his weight, then stood steady, waiting for direction. For a long moment, Elias simply sat there, looking at his life, committing it to memory one last time. Then he turned Barnaby toward the mountains and nudged him forward. They moved slowly through the snow, following the old trail that led up into the high country. Elias had traveled this path many times over the years, hunting or checking on distant fence lines. He knew every turn, every landmark, every place where the trail narrowed or where snowdrifts tended to accumulate. The morning brightened as they climbed, the sun breaking over the eastern peaks and casting long shadows across the snow. It was beautiful in a harsh way, all that white emptiness stretching in every direction, the kind of beauty that could kill a man if he wasn't careful, if he underestimated the cold or the distance or his own limitations. Elias was careful. He'd lived in these mountains his entire life and knew how quickly weather could turn, how deceptive distances could be in the thin air. He rationed his movements, conserving energy, stopping periodically to let Barnaby rest. By midday they were high above the valley, looking down on country that stretched for miles in every direction. From here, Elias could see the homestead far below, smoke rising from Raymond's chimney. His nephew would be having lunch now, warm and comfortable, probably already planning how to use Elias's absence to expand his operations. The thought should have made Elias angry, but he found he had no anger left, only a deep sadness, a sense of something precious lost not to time or accident, but to human coldness. Family was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to be a bond that held strong even when times were hard. Raymond had broken that bond, as casually as a man might snap a dry twig. They pushed higher into the mountains as the afternoon wore on. The trail became less distinct, covered in deeper snow, and Elias had to trust his memory and Barnaby's instincts to keep them on course. The trees grew thicker here, tall pines that blocked much of the wind, but also cast the trail into shadow. Evening was approaching when Elias checked the coordinates against his surroundings. According to his reckoning, they were close to Martha's property. Another hour, perhaps less, and they should reach it. He'd been imagining what they'd find for the entire journey. A collapsed cabin, most likely, rotted timbers and a caved-in roof. Maybe the foundation would still be sound enough to provide some shelter while he figured out his next move. He had tools, he could make repairs. It wouldn't be comfortable, but he'd survived worse. The light was fading when they came around a bend in the trail, and the trees opened up into a clearing. Elias stopped Barnaby abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. There, nestled among the pines, stood a house. But this was no rotting shack or abandoned cabin. This was a mansion, 2 stories of pristine timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. Warm light glowed from multiple windows, smoke rose from a chimney, and the whole property looked as well-maintained as any estate Elias had ever seen. For a long moment he simply stared, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd expected. This couldn't be Martha's place. The family had described it as worthless, a hovel not worth the journey to visit, yet here it stood, magnificent and impossible, exactly where the coordinates had led him. "Well, Barnaby," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "looks like we found more than we bargained for." The donkey's ears swiveled forward, and he snorted softly, his breath making clouds in the cold air. Elias dismounted, his legs stiff from the long ride. He led Barnaby forward slowly, approaching the mansion with cautious steps. Squatters, maybe, or someone had bought the property without the family knowing. Either way, he was trespassing, and that knowledge made him wary. The porch steps were clear of snow, swept clean recently. The front door was solid wood, well fitted, with a brass handle that gleamed in the fading light. Elias tied Barnaby to the porch rail, then stood at the door, his hand raised to knock. He hesitated. Behind this door lay answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask. Whatever he found inside would change things. He could feel that certainty in his bones. He knocked. 3 solid raps that echoed in the evening air. No answer. He waited, then knocked again. Still nothing. Slowly, carefully, Elias tried the handle. It turned easily, and the door swung open on well-oiled hinges. Warmth rushed out to meet him. Air heated by the fire he could now see burning in a large stone fireplace across a magnificent entry hall. The interior was just as impressive as the exterior, all polished wood and comfortable furniture, oil lamps casting a golden glow over everything. But there was no one there. The house was empty. "Hello?" Elias called out, his voice sounding small in the large space. "Anyone home?" Silence answered him. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him to keep the heat in. The entry hall led to several rooms, and directly ahead he could see what looked like a study or office, its door standing open. His boots echoed on the hardwood floor as he walked forward. Everything was clean, well-maintained, as if someone had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second. But the silence felt deeper than temporary absence. This was the silence of a house waiting. Elias entered the study and stopped. On a large oak desk, illuminated by an oil lamp, sat a stack of papers. Legal documents, from the look of them, with official seals and dense text. Beside them lay an envelope, yellowed slightly with age, with a single name written across it in elegant script, Elias Thorne. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope. His name, here, in a house he'd never visited, on property he'd never seen. His name waited for him as if someone had known he would come. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was careful and clear, though wavering slightly with the writer's age. "My dear Elias," it began, "if you are reading this, then the impossible has happened, and someone in our family has finally shown the kindness to visit an old woman in her final days. I passed from this world 3 days ago, peacefully and without regret, though I confess I held little hope that any of you would come before the spring thaw made travel easy again. That you came in winter tells me something important about your character." Elias sat down heavily in the desk chair, his eyes scanning the words with growing disbelief. "You have questions, I'm sure. Let me answer the most important ones. Yes, I am your great-aunt Martha. Yes, the family believed me dead and my property worthless. They were wrong on both counts, though I allowed them their illusions. The truth is, I have been far from poor, quite the opposite, in fact. I am the silent owner of the Silver Peak mine, the largest silver operation in 3 counties. The family never knew because I valued my privacy and had no use for their greed or demands." Elias's heart was pounding now. The Silver Peak mine was legendary, producing more wealth than any other operation in the region. To own it meant, he read on, "My will is among these papers. You will find that I have left everything to whichever family member shows enough kindness to visit my home before the first thaw of spring. The conditions are specific and legal. By arriving here, by making this journey, you have met those conditions. The mine is yours, Elias. The mansion is yours, all of it." The paper crinkled in his hands. He read the words again, then a third time, unable to fully comprehend what they meant. He owned the Silver Peak mine. Him, Old Bones Thorne, the useless mouth his nephew had cast out into the snow to die. With shaking hands, he picked up the legal documents. His eyes scanned the dense text, finding the key passages that confirmed what the letter had stated. The will was ironclad, witnessed and notarized, laying out clearly that the entire estate would pass to the first family member to visit before spring. There was more, a document showing ownership of land rights, mineral rights, water rights. Elias traced his finger down the list, seeing property descriptions that sounded familiar, very familiar. His breath stopped. The mine owned the land beneath the homestead, the land Raymond was farming. All of it belonged to whoever owned the mine, which now meant it belonged to him. Raymond, by throwing Elias out, had unknowingly sent him to claim an empire that owned the very ground his nephew stood on. Elias sat in Martha's chair for a long time, the documents spread before him like pieces of a puzzle that was only now coming together. The fire in the study crackled softly, and outside the window full darkness had fallen, the snow beginning to fall again in gentle flakes that caught the lamplight. His mind struggled to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. Hours ago he'd been a cast-out old man with nothing but a donkey and the clothes on his back. Now he held in his hands ownership of an empire. The shock of it made everything feel unreal, as if he might wake any moment back in the barn. This entire journey nothing but a dream. But the paper in his hands was real enough. The warmth of the fire was real. The solid weight of the chair beneath him was real. He forced himself to read through all the documents carefully, taking his time despite the way his heart raced. There were deeds, contracts, financial statements. The Silver Peak mine had been in operation for 37 years. Martha had acquired it through her late husband, who'd bought the claim when silver was first discovered. Over the decades, it had become one of the most productive mines in the territory. The financial statements made his head spin, numbers he couldn't fully comprehend, figures with so many zeros they seemed like errors. But they weren't errors. This was real wealth, the kind that could buy anything, change everything, and all of it was now his. Among the papers, he found a leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. He opened it carefully, finding pages filled with Martha's precise handwriting. This was no ordinary account book. It was a journal of sorts, recording not just financial transactions, but observations, thoughts, decisions. The first entry was dated 37 years ago, purchased controlling interest in Silver Peak Mine today. James was right about the potential. This will secure our future, and perhaps the families, if they prove worthy of it. Elias turned pages slowly, reading snippets of Martha's life, entries about mine operations mixed with personal reflections. He learned that she'd been widowed after 15 years of marriage, that she'd chosen to remain here in the mountains rather than return to family who'd never approved of her husband. He learned that she'd watched the family from a distance, keeping track of births and deaths, marriages and feuds, all while building her fortune in silence. One entry written 20 years ago made him pause. Thomas visited today, Elias's brother. A good man, though struggling with debts he's too proud to mention. I considered helping, but the moment I reveal my situation, they'll all come running with hands out. Better to wait. Better to see who comes without knowing what awaits them. So Martha had known about Thomas's struggles. She'd known about all of them, watching, waiting, testing them, in a way. Further in the ledger, he found entries about the land rights. Martha had been buying up property gradually over the years, using intermediaries and shell companies to hide her involvement. She'd acquired water rights, mineral rights, grazing rights. The scope of it was staggering. She'd built a web of ownership that covered thousands of acres, including the land where Elias had spent his entire adult life. One entry from 10 years ago read, "Completed acquisition of the valley properties. The family farms on my land now and doesn't know it. I lease it back to them through agents for nominal fees, allowing them to believe they own what they work. Perhaps cruel, but I wanted to see what they'd do with security. Would they become generous, grateful, or would they grow harder, meaner?" Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Martha had been testing them all along, conducting some grand experiment in human nature, and apparently they'd failed. The most recent entries were different in tone, written in a hand that shook with age. "I'm dying." The doctor confirmed it. I have months, perhaps weeks, time to set things in motion. I've drafted my will with specific conditions. The estate goes to whoever shows kindness enough to visit before spring thaw, not after, when travel is easy and costs nothing. During winter, when coming here means sacrifice, means risk, means caring enough to brave hardship. The next entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. No one has come. I didn't expect they would. They think me dead already, or too poor to bother with. Fine. Let the lawyers handle it come spring. Let whoever stumbles up here claim what they find. At least it won't go to those who valued money over family. The final entry was dated 3 days ago, the handwriting barely legible. Still no one. I go to my rest, disappointed but not surprised. Goodbye, whoever you are that finds this. I hope you prove worthier than those I knew. Elias closed the ledger carefully, his throat tight. Martha had died alone, waiting for family that never came, hoping someone would care enough to visit an old woman in the mountains, and none of them had. None of them had even thought to check if she still lived, except him, and he'd come only because Raymond had thrown him out with nowhere else to go. Was that kindness, or just desperate circumstance? He stood, his legs stiff, and walked through the house. It was larger than he'd realized, with 6 bedrooms upstairs, a kitchen that was better equipped than any he'd seen, a dining room with a table that could seat 12. Everything was clean, well-maintained, suggesting Martha had 3 Ts, employed staff who'd kept the property in order. In the kitchen, he found fresh food in the pantry, preserved goods, dried meats, flour, salt, enough to last months. The stove was well-made, modern, with good draft. Water came from a pump at the sink, cold and clear. He made himself coffee, his hands working automatically while his mind spun. The familiar ritual grounded him, gave him something normal to focus on, while everything else turned upside down. By the time he'd finished his coffee, standing at the kitchen window watching snow fall through the lamplight, his shock was beginning to give way to something else. Understanding, and with understanding came the first stirrings of something that felt like justice. Raymond had called him a useless mouth, had calculated Elias's worth in purely economic terms, and found him wanting, had thrown him out into winter weather that could have killed him, all in the name of efficiency and profit, and in doing so had given Elias the means to own everything Raymond thought was his. The irony was so perfect it almost made him laugh. Almost. But there was too much pain wrapped up in it for real humor, too much loss. Clara would have appreciated the twist, though. She'd always had a better sense of cosmic justice than he did. He returned to the study and read through the documents again, this time making careful notes. He needed to understand exactly what he owned, what it meant legally, how to proceed. The will was clear, witnessed properly, filed with attorneys in town. Martha had been thorough, leaving no room for challenges or disputes. The mine was his, the mansion was his, the land rights were his, which meant Raymond was now his tenant, farming land that Elias owned, living in a house on property that belonged to him. The question was, what to do about it? Elias wasn't a vengeful man by nature. He'd spent his life working honestly, treating people fairly, expecting the same in return. But Raymond had shown him that fairness wasn't always reciprocated, that family bonds could be broken for. Something as cold as a financial calculation. Part of him, the part that still hurt from yesterday's betrayal, wanted to use this power immediately, to march down the mountain and throw Raymond off the land the way he'd been thrown off, to take back everything that had been taken from him with interest. But another part, the part that sounded like Clara in his head, counseled patience. Rushed decisions made in anger rarely turned out well. Better to think it through, consider all the angles, decide what kind of man he wanted to be in the face of this impossible reversal. He was tired. The journey had taken more out of him than he'd realized, and the shock of the last hour had drained what energy remained. Upstairs, he found a bedroom that looked recently used, probably Martha's. The bed was made with clean linens, a quilt folded at the foot. He sat on the edge of it, feeling the softness give under his weight. Through the window, he could see Barnaby on the porch, standing patiently where Elias had tied him. The donkey needed care, needed shelter and food. Elias went back downstairs and outside into the snow. The cold hit him immediately, making him grateful for the coat he wore. He untied Barnaby and led him around the side of the house, where he found a small barn, well built and weatherproof. Inside were 2 stalls, one with fresh hay already laid out, as if prepared for visitors. He settled Barnaby for the night, giving him feed and water, checking his hooves and legs to make sure the journey hadn't caused any problems. The donkey seemed content, unbothered by their changed circumstances, interested only in the hay and the warmth of shelter. "Sleep well, old friend," Elias told him. "Tomorrow we figure out what happens next." Back in the house, he locked the doors and banked the fire. Upstairs in Martha's room, he lay down on the bed fully clothed, too exhausted to do more. The ceiling was tongue and groove pine, beautifully finished, and he stared at it while his mind slowly wound down. He owned a silver mine. He owned this mansion. He owned the land Raymond was farming. The thought circled until eventually, despite everything, sleep claimed him. He dreamed of Clara, sitting by a fire, sewing that red blanket. In the dream she looked up at him and smiled, and he knew somehow that she was proud of him, that she understood what had happened and approved. When he tried to speak, to ask her what he should do, she just shook her head and went back to her stitching, humming a song he couldn't quite place. He woke once in the night, disoriented, forgetting where he was. Then memory returned, and with it the weight of impossible fortune, and the question of what came next. Morning came with brilliant sunshine, reflecting off fresh snow, turning the world outside into a blaze of white and blue that hurt to look at directly. Elias woke slowly, his body protesting the long ride from yesterday and the unfamiliar bed. For a moment he lay still, staring at the ceiling, half convinced the previous day had been some elaborate dream. Then he turned his head and saw the stack of documents on the bedside table where he'd placed them last night, and reality settled over him again with all its impossible weight. He rose, dressed, and made his way downstairs. The house was cold but not freezing, the fire having burned down to embers during the night. He built it back up, his hands moving through the familiar task, while his mind wandered. Outside, he could hear Barnaby making contented sounds from the barn, probably hoping for breakfast. After tending to the donkey and eating a simple meal of bread and preserved meat from Martha's well-stocked pantry, Elias returned to the study. In daylight, the room looked even more impressive, with built-in bookshelves lining 2 walls and a large window offering a view of the snow-covered mountains. He spent the morning reading through more of Martha's papers, piecing together the full scope of what she'd built. The mine itself was a massive operation, employing over 100 men with sophisticated equipment and multiple shafts. It produced not just silver, but also trace amounts of gold and copper. The monthly revenue figures made his head spin. Among the personal items in the study, he found a small wooden box on a shelf. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was a cameo locket on a delicate gold chain. He opened it carefully, finding 2 tiny photographs inside. One showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hair styled in the fashion of 50 years ago. The other showed a man in formal dress, handsome and serious. Martha and her husband, he guessed. This was what remained of their love, captured in miniature and kept close. He thought of the red blanket from Clara, how objects could carry so much meaning, so much memory. This locket represented Martha's entire emotional world, and she'd kept it here in this study where she conducted her business, a reminder perhaps of why she'd worked so hard, of what and who she'd done it all for. He set the locket back in its box, feeling like an intruder on private grief. The practical question that had been forming since yesterday became more urgent. What was he supposed to do with all this? He was a cowboy, a farmer, a man who understood horses and weather and the rhythm of seasons. He knew nothing about running a mine, managing investments, overseeing an empire. Among Martha's papers, he found a letter of introduction to her attorney, a man named Howard Garrison in the town of Silver Creek, 2 days' ride from here. The letter explained that whoever presented it was the new owner of the estate and should be given full cooperation and explanation of all holdings. He would need to make that trip, Elias realized. He would need to meet with Garrison, learn the details of what he'd inherited, make it all official and legal. But not yet, not today. He needed time to think, to understand what he wanted before dealing with lawyers and documents and making his ownership public knowledge. Because once people knew, everything would change. Raymond would know, the whole valley would know, and then there would be no going back, no quiet, contemplation, no space to decide who he wanted to be in light of this reversal. He walked through the mansion again, this time paying closer attention. In one upstairs bedroom, he found women's clothing in the wardrobe, simple dresses and practical wear. Martha's, preserved as if she might return any moment. In another room, he found what looked like a guest bedroom, unused but maintained. The more he saw, the sadder it made him. This beautiful house, all this wealth, and Martha had died alone. No family around her, no one to hold her hand or ease her passing. She'd built an empire and used it as a test, and they'd all failed her without even knowing they were being tested. The irony cut deep. If the family had simply shown basic kindness, basic human decency, they would have inherited everything. Instead, their neglect had ensured the fortune went to the one person cast out by that same family. By afternoon, Elias had made a decision, or at least the beginning of one. He would stay here for a few more days, learn what he could from Martha's papers, prepare himself mentally for what came next. Then he would ride to Silver Creek and meet with Garrison. Only after understanding the full legal situation would he decide how to deal with Raymond. He spent the rest of the day reading through more of the ledger, learning about Martha's life through her careful notes. She'd been shrewd in business, fair with her employees, generous with the town of Silver Creek, in quiet ways. She'd funded a school, a church, improvements to the main street, all anonymously, all through agents, maintaining her privacy while doing good. That spoke to her character, Elias thought. She could have been another Raymond, hoarding wealth and caring only for profit. Instead, she'd used her fortune to help others while asking nothing in return. One entry from 15 years ago caught his attention. Saw Elias in town today. He didn't see me. He was helping an old man load supplies into a wagon, refusing payment, just doing it because it needed doing. He has Clara with him, and the way they are together reminds me of James and me. Some people marry for advantage, some marry for love. Those who marry for love are the lucky ones, even if they never get rich. So Martha had watched him, had observed his life from a distance. The thought made him uncomfortable, but also touched him in a way he couldn't quite define. She'd known him, or at least known of him, had seen something in him that made her include his name on that envelope. Unless the envelope had been written only after he arrived? No, the age of the paper suggested it had been placed there days or weeks ago. She'd expected him specifically. Somehow, she'd known he would be the one to come. Or perhaps she'd simply prepared envelopes for anyone who might arrive, with names written based on who was still alive in the family. That seemed more likely, less mystical, more practical. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink, Elias sat in the study with a glass of whiskey he'd found in a cabinet. Good whiskey, smooth and warming. He raised the glass toward the window, toward the mountains and the sky. "To you, Martha," he said quietly. "Thank you for your strange kindness. I hope I prove worthy of it." The whiskey burned pleasantly going down, and he sat there as darkness fell, watching the first stars appear, thinking about the strange path that had led him here. Cast out by greed, saved by a test he hadn't known he was taking, now holding power. over the very person who'd cast him out. It felt like something from a story, the kind of tale people told around fires on cold nights, the kind with a moral about pride and hubris, about how cruelty can circle back on itself. But this wasn't a story. This was his life, changed utterly in the space of a single day. And tomorrow would bring the next chapter, whatever that might be. 3 days passed before Elias felt ready to make the journey to Silver Creek. He spent that time living in Martha's house, learning its rhythms, reading through her extensive collection of books and records. Each day brought new understanding of what she'd built and how carefully she'd constructed this empire of silence. He found the mine ownership map on the 4th morning, rolled up in a leather tube in the back of a closet. When he spread it across the study desk, weighing down the corners with books, he finally saw the full scope of Martha's holdings in visual form. The map was detailed, professionally drawn, showing property boundaries, water rights, mineral claims, and access roads across 3 counties. Different colors marked different types of ownership: red for the mine itself and its immediate operations, blue for water rights, green for surface land, yellow for mineral rights beneath properties where others thought they owned the land. Elias traced the boundaries with his finger, following the complex web of ownership. The Silver Peak mine sat at the center, a sprawling, red area in the high mountains. From there, blue lines snaked down through valleys, following streams and rivers. Green parcels dotted the landscape, seemingly random, until he looked closer and realized they controlled access points, choke points, strategic locations that gave the owner leverage over everything around them. And there, marked in yellow with careful notation, was the homestead, his homestead, or what he'd thought was his homestead for 40 years. The surface belonged to Raymond now, inherited from Thomas. But the mineral rights, the water rights, even the access road, all belonged to whoever owned the mine, which meant Raymond owned nothing but the right to farm soil that sat on top of someone else's property, using water someone else controlled, traveling roads someone else maintained. The extent of Martha's planning was breathtaking. She hadn't just bought a mine. She'd bought control of an entire region, piece by piece, year by year, until she held all the important cards while letting others think they held the power. Elias studied the map for hours, memorizing the boundaries, understanding the relationships between different parcels. Every time he thought he'd grasped the full picture, he'd notice another detail, another connection, another layer of careful acquisition. There was a key in the corner listing property values and annual revenues. The numbers beside the mine made sense, given what he'd learned from the financial statements. But there were other revenue streams too, smaller but steady. Lease payments for water rights, access fees for roads, grazing permits on land others thought was public. Dozens of small income sources that added up to substantial amounts. Martha had built something remarkable here. Not just wealth for its own sake, but a carefully balanced system where every piece supported and protected the others. On the 5th morning, Elias packed supplies for the journey to Silver Creek. He dressed in his best clothes, such as they were, and made sure all the legal documents were safely stored in his saddlebags. The letter of introduction to Howard Garrison went in his coat pocket, where he could access it easily. Barnaby seemed pleased to be traveling again after days of rest and good feed. The donkey's coat gleamed, his hooves were in good shape, and his pack saddle sat comfortably across the red blanket that Clara had made so many years ago. Before leaving, Elias walked through the mansion one final time. He wasn't sure when he'd return, and he wanted to fix it in his memory. In the study, he paused at Martha's desk, running his hand across the smooth wood surface where she'd sat so many times, making decisions, recording her thoughts, watching over an empire that no one knew she commanded. He picked up the cameo locket from its box and held it in his palm, feeling its slight weight. After a moment's thought, he slipped it into his pocket. Martha should be represented when he met with her attorney. and this seemed like the right token to carry. The ride down the mountain was easier than the climb up had been. The weather held clear and cold, and Barnaby moved with sure-footed confidence over trails that were becoming familiar. By late afternoon, they descended below the snow line into country where the ground showed brown and dead grass between patches of white. Elias stopped for the night at a spot where a small creek ran clear and cold. He made a simple camp, feeding Barnaby and eating dried meat and bread from his supplies. The fire he built was small but sufficient, and he sat beside it watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow he would reach Silver Creek. Tomorrow he would meet with Garrison and make his ownership official. Tomorrow everything would begin to change in ways he still couldn't fully predict. He thought about Raymond, probably sitting comfortable in the homestead right now, believing he'd successfully removed an inconvenient burden. Did his nephew ever think about him? Wonder if he'd survived the journey? Care whether the old man he'd thrown out had frozen in some mountain pass? Probably not. Raymond had made his calculation and moved on, the way he seemed to move through life, efficiently, without sentiment, always focused on the next advantage. What would Raymond do when he learned the truth, when he discovered that the useless old mouth he'd discarded now owned everything Raymond thought was his? The thought should have given Elias satisfaction, but instead it just made him tired. This wasn't the revenge he would have chosen. This wasn't how he'd wanted his family story to unfold. But it was what it was, and he would deal with it as best he could. He slept lightly that night, waking several times to feed the fire and check on Barnaby. Each time he woke, he saw stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns about property and wealth and family betrayals. There was comfort in that indifference, in the reminder that his problems, however large, they felt, were small things under that vast sky. Morning came with frost on everything, turning the world silver in the early light. Elias broke camp efficiently, packed his gear, and mounted Barnaby as the sun broke over the eastern hills. Silver Creek lay 3 hours ahead, by his estimate. He'd been there many times over the years, buying supplies, selling what little surplus the homestead produced, occasionally stopping at the saloon for a quiet drink and conversation with other ranchers and farmers. He'd always been just Elias Thorne there, an aging cowboy living a modest life on family land. After today, he would be something different. Owner of the Silver Peak Mine, one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties, a man of property and power. The thought sat uneasily on him. He'd never wanted to be that kind of man, never aspired to more than a good life with people he loved, doing honest work. Now fate or Martha's strange test or simple circumstance had thrust him into a role he'd never sought. The question was whether he could carry that role with the same integrity he'd tried to bring to his simpler life. Whether wealth would change him the way it had changed Raymond, making him hard and calculating, or whether he could stay himself, stay the man Clara had loved, the man Martha had apparently seen, helping that old man load supplies 15 years ago. He would find out soon enough. By mid-morning, the town of Silver Creek came into view, nestled in a valley where 3 streams converged. It was larger than Elias remembered, grown substantially in recent years. New buildings lined the main street, and he could see a church steeple that hadn't been there the last time he'd visited. Growth meant prosperity, probably driven by the mine that he now owned. Strange to think that he'd benefited from this place without knowing it, that the town's expansion had been built partly on wealth that was now his. He rode down the main street slowly, noting the changes. A new general store, a hotel that looked substantial and well-maintained, a restaurant with glass windows and painted signs. People watched him pass, the way small-town folk always watched strangers or infrequent visitors. He kept his hat pulled low, not ready yet to be recognized or engage in conversation. The law office of Howard Garrison was in a brick building near the center of town, with a wooden sign out front displaying his name in gold letters. Elias tied Barnaby to the hitching post and stood for a moment, gathering himself. This was it, the moment everything became official and real. Once he walked through that door, there would be no going back. No, pretending the last week had been some strange dream. He pulled the letter of introduction from his pocket, checked that the other documents were secure in his saddlebag, and climbed the steps to the office door. The office interior was warm and smelled of paper and leather. A young clerk sat at a desk near the door, and he looked up when Elias entered, his expression shifting from polite interest to mild confusion at the sight of a weather-worn cowboy in simple clothes. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked. "I'm here to see Howard Garrison. I have a letter of introduction from Martha Thorne." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Martha Thorne? One moment, please." He disappeared through a door into an inner office. Elias heard low voices, then the clerk returned and gestured toward the door. "Mr. Garrison will see you immediately." The inner office was lined with law books and filing cabinets. Behind a large oak desk sat a man in his 60s, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a suit that suggested success without ostentation. He stood when Elias entered, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm Howard Garrison. You have a letter from Martha?" Elias handed over the envelope. Garrison opened it, read quickly, then read again more slowly. His expression changed, surprise, and something like sadness crossing his features. "So she's passed then. I'd been expecting it, but still." He gestured to a chair. "Please sit, Mr. Thorne. We have much to discuss." Elias sat, his hat in his hands. Garrison studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Martha was a remarkable woman, one of the most intelligent people I've ever had the privilege to know. She hired me 30 years ago when I was a young attorney fresh from back east, gave me my start in this territory. Everything I am professionally, I owe to her guidance." He paused. "Did you know her well?" "I never met her, not that I can recall." "Yet you came to her home in winter. That's interesting." "I had nowhere else to go." Garrison nodded slowly. "She predicted that, you know. Not specifically, but generally. She said whoever came would come out of necessity, not greed. That the test would be whether they made the journey despite hardship rather than because of opportunity. It was a test, then. Everything with Martha was a test. She was testing the family for 30 years, watching from a distance, measuring character against circumstance. Garrison opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. "She left this for whoever qualified under the will. It's addressed to you specifically, which suggests she had some idea who would come, even if she couldn't be certain." The envelope was heavy paper, sealed with red wax bearing Martha's initials. Elias's name was written across it in her careful hand. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "My dear Elias," it began, "if you are reading this in Mr. Garrison's office, then my test has concluded, and you have proven yourself worthy. I suspect you came because Raymond threw you out. That boy always had ice where his heart should be, too much like his grandfather on his mother's side. I'm sorry you suffered his cruelty, but I'm grateful it sent you to me, even if I was already gone." Elias felt his throat tighten. She'd known, somehow, she'd known exactly how this would unfold. "You're wondering why I chose this strange path, why I didn't simply divide my estate among the family or give it all to charity. The truth is, I wanted to see if anyone in our family still understood that some things matter more than money. Kindness, loyalty, the simple act of checking on an old woman in the mountains. I set the test with winter as the barrier, knowing it would cost something to come, would require effort and care, not just a convenient afternoon visit when weather was pleasant." The letter continued. "What you do with this fortune is your choice now. I won't control you from beyond the grave. But I will offer one piece of advice, given with love. Don't become what you've suffered from. Don't let wealth harden you the way poverty never could. Stay the man I saw helping that stranger in town all those years ago, expecting nothing, simply doing what was right because it was right." She signed it simply, "Martha," with a final line, "P.S. The locket in my study was my most precious possession. If you found it, know that you're welcome to keep it or return it to my grave. Either way, carry the memory of love that never counted cost." Elias carefully folded the letter and placed it in his pocket next to the locket. Garrison had been watching him quietly. "She was fond of you, in her way, mentioned you several times over the years, said you reminded her of her late husband James. I wish I'd known her." "So do I, for your sake. She would have liked to meet you properly." Garrison pulled a thick folder from a cabinet. "Now, to business. The estate is substantial and complex. I'll need several hours to walk you through everything. Do you have time today?" "I have time." They spent the afternoon going over documents. Garrison explained the mine operations, the revenue streams, the investments and holdings. He showed Elias the property maps in detail, explaining what each parcel meant, how they fit together, why Martha had acquired them. The genius of her approach, Garrison said, was in understanding leverage. She didn't need to own everything. She just needed to own the key pieces that gave her control over everything else. Water rights here, access roads there, mineral rights under property someone else thought they fully owned. Like the homestead where I lived. Exactly like that. She bought the mineral and water rights 20 years ago when your brother Thomas was in financial trouble. He needed cash, and she provided it through an intermediary. He never knew it was her. He sold rights he didn't think were valuable, and she acquired control without anyone realizing it. So Raymond thinks he owns the land, but he only owns surface rights. You own everything underneath and the water that flows through, which means you control whether he can farm it successfully or not." Garrison leaned back in his chair. "What do you plan to do about that?" It was the question Elias had been avoiding. "I don't know yet." "Fair enough. It's not a decision to make lightly." Garrison paused. "For what it's worth, Martha left instructions that if you wanted to evict anyone from property you now control, I was to handle it swiftly and legally. She anticipated you might face that choice with Raymond specifically. She saw everything, didn't she? She saw people clearly. That was both her gift and her curse." Garrison pulled out another document. "There's one more thing. The mine employees. They don't know Martha has passed yet. I've been managing operations through her usual intermediaries, waiting for her heir to be determined. They'll need to meet you soon. Understand there's been a change in ownership. What kind of people are they? Good people, mostly. Hard-working. Martha treated them fairly, paid above standard wages, provided for injuries and retirements. They were loyal to her, even though most never met her. They'll need to know they can trust you to continue that treatment." Elias absorbed that. More responsibility, more people depending on him. "When should I meet them?" "Soon. Within the week would be best. They're starting to hear rumors, asking questions." Garrison studied him. "Are you ready for this? It's a lot to take on." "I don't know if anyone could be ready for this." "True. But Martha thought you could handle it, and in 30 years I never knew her to be wrong about people." They continued through the afternoon, covering banking arrangements, ongoing contracts, legal obligations. By the time they finished, Elias's head was swimming with information. Garrison had his clerk make copies of key documents for Elias to take with him. "One last thing," Garrison said as Elias prepared to leave. "Martha's funeral. She's buried on her property, in a spot she chose years ago. She wanted it private, just you if you cared to visit. There's a marker already in place. I can draw you a map to find it." "I'd like that." Garrison sketched a quick map showing where, on Martha's property, the grave was located. "She's beneath an old pine, overlooking the valley. Said it reminded her of places she'd been happy." Elias took the map, adding it to the collection of papers that now defined his new life. "Thank you for your help today. It's what she paid me well to do. And honestly, I'm glad it's you. I've handled enough estates to know that money usually brings out the worst in people. Martha was betting you'd be different." Garrison extended his hand. "Prove her right." They shook, and Elias left the office feeling like he'd aged. Another 10 years in a single afternoon. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, heavier than any pack he'd ever carried. Elias stayed in Silver Creek that night, renting a room at the hotel Garrison had recommended. It was nicer than anywhere he'd stayed in years, with a real bed, clean sheets, and hot water for washing. He lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through everything he'd learned. The mine employed over 100 men. They depended on him now for their livelihoods, for their families' futures. That responsibility felt immense, larger than anything he'd carried before. When it had been just him and Clara working the homestead, the consequences of his decisions affected only them. Now, a mistake could ripple out to touch hundreds of lives. He thought about Martha, dying alone in that beautiful house, waiting for someone to care enough to visit. The sadness of it stayed with him, a hollow ache that no amount of money could fill or justify. She'd built an empire, tested her family, and found them all wanting until desperation drove one of them to her door. Was that victory or defeat? Had she won her test or simply proven what she'd suspected all along, that people were fundamentally selfish, coming only when they had nowhere else to go? Morning found him tired, but resolved. Before dealing with Raymond, before meeting the mine employees, before stepping fully into his new role, he needed to pay his respects to Martha properly. She deserved that much at least. He rode back up into the mountains, following Garrison's map to a location about a mile from the mansion. The grave was where the attorney had indicated, beneath a massive old-growth pine that stood alone on a small rise. From here, the view stretched for miles across valleys and peaks, a landscape of stunning beauty that few people ever saw. The gravestone was simple granite, well made, but not ostentatious. It read, "Martha Ann Thorne, beloved wife of James, beloved of no one else, died as she lived, alone." The dates beneath showed she'd lived to 92 years old. Elias stood before the stone for a long time, his hat in his hands. The inscription was bitter, an indictment of the family that had forgotten her. Yet she'd still left everything to that family, still hoped someone would prove worthy. The contradiction spoke to complexity. He wished he'd had the chance to understand better. "I'm sorry I never came sooner," he said quietly. "If I'd known you were here, known you were real and not just a family legend, I would have visited. Not for what you could give me, but because you were family, and family shouldn't die alone." The wind moved through the pine branches overhead, a sound like soft breathing or distant whispers. Snow dusted the ground around the grave, pristine and undisturbed, except for his footprints. He pulled the cameo locket from his pocket and opened it, looking at the faces of Martha and James preserved there. They'd been young once, in love, building a life together. Then James had died, and Martha had gone on alone for decades, building wealth that meant nothing without someone to share it with. The parallel to his own life struck him hard. He and Clara had been happy, had built something meaningful together. Then she'd passed, and he'd continued alone, working the homestead, maintaining what they'd created. If not for Raymond's cruelty, he might have died there eventually, content in his simple life. But would that have been enough? Or would he have died like Martha, surrounded by things but starved for connection, testing a family that had already failed him in small ways before Raymond's big betrayal? "I found your locket," he said to the grave. "It's beautiful. I'll keep it safe. Remember what it represented. Love that counted no cost," you wrote. "I understand that. Clara and I had that too." He knelt and placed his hand on the cold granite. "I'll try to be worthy of what you've given me. I'll try not to become hard or calculating. I'll try to stay the man Clara loved, the man you apparently saw in me all those years ago." The promise felt inadequate, but it was all he had to offer. He stayed there for another hour, sitting on a fallen log near the grave, looking out at the view Martha had chosen for her final rest. Eagles soared on thermals in the distance. Clouds moved across the sky, casting shadows that raced across the valleys. Below, Everything was vast and timeless, putting human concerns into proper scale. Eventually, he rose and returned to Barnaby, who'd been grazing on what dry grass he could find beneath the snow. The donkey looked at him with patient eyes, waiting to learn where they would go next. "Home," Elias said, swinging into the saddle. "Or what passes for home now." They rode back to the mansion as afternoon shadows lengthened. Elias spent the evening going through more of Martha's papers, finding details he'd missed before. She'd kept journals beyond the ledger, personal reflections on life and loss, and the choices that had led her to die alone despite great wealth. One entry, written a decade ago, resonated. "Saw a family in town today, poor as church mice but rich in what matters." The children laughed. The parents touched each other with easy affection. They had nothing and everything at once. "I have everything and nothing." The irony would be funny if it weren't so tragic. Another, more recent, "Money is the worst thing that ever happened to this family. Before the mine, before James struck silver, we were close. We struggled together, supported each other. Then wealth came, and everyone scattered, eyeing each other suspiciously, calculating who deserved what. I kept building the fortune, thinking it would bring them back. Instead, it drove them further away. The great test of my life has been whether I can find one person who values connection over accumulation. So far, the answer appears to be no." Elias closed the journal, his heart heavy. Martha had understood exactly what she'd lost and why. The tragedy wasn't that she'd died alone, but that she'd seen it coming for decades and been powerless to change it. He wouldn't make that mistake. Whatever he did with this fortune, he wouldn't let it isolate him, wouldn't let it become a wall between him and other people. The challenge would be figuring out how to use wealth without being used by it. The next morning, he wrote a letter to Garrison, asking him to arrange a meeting with the mine foreman and key employees. If he was going to do this, he needed to understand the operation, meet the people who made it work. He couldn't hide in this mansion forever, postponing the future. He also wrote a shorter note, one he didn't send, addressed to Raymond. It said simply, "I survived the winter. I found shelter. I'm coming home." He tore it up after writing it, not ready yet for that confrontation. But it helped to put the thoughts on paper, to clarify what he needed to say when the time came. That time was coming soon. He could feel it approaching like another storm, inevitable and probably destructive. The question was whether he would meet it with wisdom or vengeance, mercy or justice. Martha's ghost seemed to hover in the mansion, watching, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was when tested by power instead of poverty. He spent another day at the mansion, then packed his things. He would return, but first he needed to visit the mine, meet the employees, understand what he was really responsible for. Garrison had sent word that the foreman could meet him in 2 days at the mine office. Elias locked the mansion behind him, a strange act given that he now owned it, that he could come and go as he pleased. But it felt important to close that door properly, to mark the ending of one phase and the beginning of another. Barnaby carried him down the mountain trail toward Silver Creek and whatever waited beyond. The sun was bright, the air cold and clean, and ahead lay responsibilities he still didn't feel prepared for. But ready or not, life was moving forward, carrying him with it toward confrontations and choices he couldn't avoid. Martha had set this in motion with her test, her will, her strange faith that someone would prove worthy. Now it was up to him to prove her right or wrong. The weight of that expectation sat heavy on his shoulders, heavier even than the saddlebags full of legal documents that bounced against Barnaby's sides with each step. The Silver Peak mine sat in a canyon carved over millennia by a creek that now ran silver-gray with mineral runoff. The operation was larger than Elias had imagined, with multiple building complexes, rail lines leading to ore processors, and the dark mouths of mine shafts cut into the mountainside like wounds in the earth. He arrived in late morning, Barnaby picking his way. carefully along the access road that switched back down into the canyon. Men were everywhere, moving with purpose, loading ore carts, operating machinery that clanked and groaned. The noise was constant, a symphony of industry that echoed off the canyon walls. A wooden building near the main shaft bore a sign reading, "Office." Elias tied Barnaby to a post outside and climbed the steps, aware of the curious looks from workers who paused in their tasks to watch him pass. He was clearly not one of them, not dressed for mine work, and his age marked him as unlikely to be seeking employment. Inside, a middle-aged man sat at a desk covered in papers and maps. He looked up when Elias entered, his weathered face showing the kind of lines that came from years of outdoor work and responsibility. His eyes were shrewd but not unkind. "Help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for James Sullivan, the foreman." "You found him," Sullivan stood, extending a hand. "And you'd be Elias Thorne, I'm guessing. Garrison sent word you'd be coming." They shook hands. Sullivan's grip was firm, callous from work despite his administrative role. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne. We've got things to discuss." Sullivan gestured to a chair, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on a small stove. "I've been running this mine for Martha Thorne for 23 years. Good years, mostly. She was a fair owner, better than most. Cared about safety, paid decent wages, didn't squeeze every penny at the expense of the men. I'm hoping to continue that," Elias said. "That's good to hear. The men are nervous about change, always are when ownership transfers." Sullivan settled back in his chair, studying Elias over the rim of his coffee cup. "Garrison told me your family, that you inherited under some special conditions in the will." "That's right. Must have been quite a surprise, inheriting a silver mine." "You could say that." Sullivan nodded slowly. "I knew Martha as well as anyone could, which is to say not very well. She kept her distance, ran things through intermediaries, mostly. But every few months she'd come down here herself, walk through the operation, talk to the men. She knew the mine inside out, understood the work better than most owners who inherit these operations. You planning to do the same?" "I don't know much about mining," Elias admitted, "but I'm willing to learn." "Honest answer. I appreciate that." Sullivan pulled a letter from his desk drawer. "Martha left this for me to give to whoever inherited. She said it was important that I should make sure they read it before making any decisions about the operation." The envelope was similar to the others Martha had left, sealed with her distinctive red wax. Elias broke it open and read, "Dear Mr. Sullivan, if you are reading this to my heir, then I have passed and left you in the difficult position of serving a new master. I'm sorry for that. You've been loyal and capable, and you deserve better than uncertainty. What I'm about to tell you, I never told you while alive because it wasn't necessary, but it's necessary now. The mine is not what you think it is." Elias felt a chill run through him as he continued reading. "Silver Peak produces silver, yes, but that's not where its real value lies. 15 years ago, we struck something else in the deepest shaft, something I've kept secret from everyone except my personal geologist. Beneath the silver deposits, there's gold. Not trace amounts, but a vein of unprecedented size and purity. I've been extracting it carefully, in small quantities, hiding the operation within the larger silver works. The reason was simple. I wanted to see what my family would do if they thought they were inheriting a good silver mine. Would they be grateful? Would they manage it responsibly? Or would they destroy it, trying to squeeze out more profit?" Elias's hands shook slightly. He looked up at Sullivan, who was watching him with unreadable eyes. "You knew about this?" "Not until 3 days ago, when Garrison sent me a sealed letter explaining that I should expect Martha's heir and provide this explanation. I've been walking around half in shock since then." Sullivan leaned forward. "She's telling the truth, Mr. Thorne. I went down into Shaft 7 with her geologist, a man named Peter Chen, who's been on private contract for years. The gold is real, and the amount of it makes the silver operation look like pocket change. Elias returned to the letter. Why did I keep this secret? Because gold makes people crazy. It makes them greedy, reckless, willing to destroy anything to get more. I've seen it happen to good men. I wanted my heir to first learn responsibility with a successful but modest operation. If they could manage the silver mine well, treat the workers fairly, resist the urge to maximize profit at any cost, then perhaps they could be trusted with the truth about the gold. The question now, Sullivan said quietly, is what you're going to do with this information. I don't even know what to think about it. That's probably the right first response. Sullivan pulled out a map and spread it on the desk. Shaft 7 goes deeper than the others, following the gold vein. Martha limited extraction to maybe 5% of what we could pull out if we went full operation. She was banking the discovery, literally, leaving it for whoever came after her. Elias studied the map, seeing the shaft marked with annotations in Martha's handwriting, estimates of quantity, purity, value. The numbers were staggering, multiples of what the entire silver operation was worth. How many people know about this? As of now, you, me, Peter Chen the geologist, and Garrison the attorney. That's it? Not even the miners working Shaft 7 know what they're really digging through. Martha structured it so the gold extraction happens during night shifts with a specialized crew of 3. Men who think they're doing quality samples for silver purity. The actual gold goes out disguised as silver shipments. This is insane. It's Martha, Sullivan said with a slight smile. Everything she did was calculated 3 moves ahead. She's been running the most sophisticated secret operation I've ever heard of, right under everyone's noses, for 15 years. Elias stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mine operation. Dozens of men working, earning their wages, supporting families, all of it sitting on top of wealth that dwarfed what anyone suspected. What happens if word gets out? You'll have every fortune hunter, claim jumper, and unscrupulous operator in 3 territories descending on this place. You'll have family members you've never met claiming rights. You'll have legal challenges, maybe violence. Gold does that to people. Sullivan came to stand beside him. Martha's letter has a recommendation. You want to hear it? Yes. She suggests you continue the current operation for at least a year. Get to know the mine, the men, the business. Learn how to manage what's already here before you try to manage what's hidden below. And she suggests you think very carefully about whether you even want to extract the gold at all, or whether leaving it in the ground might be the wiser choice. Leave it in the ground? Why would anyone do that? Because some things are more valuable left alone than exploited. That's what she believed. Anyway, Sullivan returned to his desk and pulled out another document. This is the geologist's most recent report. The gold vein might run for miles. It might be one of the largest undiscovered deposits in North America. Extracting it all would take decades and billions of dollars in investment. It would turn this quiet operation into something massive and uncontrollable. Elias felt overwhelmed. Yesterday he'd thought he understood what he'd inherited, a prosperous silver mine, valuable land, enough wealth to live comfortably. Now he was learning that beneath that already improbable fortune lay another one, hidden and dangerous. I need time to think about this. That's what Martha hoped you'd say. The wrong answer would have been to immediately start planning how to extract it all. Sullivan extended his hand again. Why don't you spend some time here? Meet the workers, learn the operation, see what you're really dealing with before making decisions about the gold. Elias shook his hand, grateful for the foreman's steady presence. I'd like that. Thank you for your honesty. It's what Martha paid me for, that and keeping her secrets. Sullivan walked him to the door. One more thing. Your nephew Raymond, he came by here 2 days ago, asking questions about the mine's ownership, trying to determine if there might be family claims he could pursue. I told him the estate was in probate and he'd need to talk to the attorneys. But he's sniffing around, probably. Heard rumors about Martha's death. The news hit Elias like cold water. Raymond already knew something had changed. The confrontation he'd been postponing was coming, whether he was ready or not. "What did you tell him about me?" "Nothing. He doesn't know you inherited, doesn't know you're alive. Far as I can tell, he was fishing, trying to figure out if there was an angle he could work." Of course he was. Raymond never missed an opportunity to calculate advantage. Elias thanked Sullivan and left the office, his mind reeling. The gold changed everything. Martha's test had layers he was only beginning to understand. She hadn't just given him wealth. She'd given him a choice, a test within the test. What kind of man would he be with this knowledge? Would he become consumed by the fortune hidden in the earth, or would he stay focused on the people who depended on the operation as it was? He mounted Barnaby and sat there for a moment, looking at the mine that was now his responsibility. Somewhere deep below, in darkness where no one but a few trusted people knew to look, lay wealth beyond imagining. And somewhere down the mountain, Raymond was scheming, trying to find an angle, completely unaware that the uncle he'd thrown away now controlled everything Raymond had ever wanted. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so heavy with consequence. Elias spent the next week at the mine, learning everything Sullivan would teach him. He went down into the shafts, watched the extraction process, talked with the workers. Most were good men, dedicated to honest work, supporting families in Silver Creek and the surrounding towns. They watched him warily at first, uncertain about this quiet older man who'd appeared as their new owner, but his willingness to listen and learn gradually won their cautious respect. He met Peter Chen, the geologist who'd kept Martha's secret for 15 years. Chen was a precise, careful man in his 50s who showed Elias the gold vein in Shaft 7 with scientific detachment, explaining the formation, the purity, the bedia, the extraordinary nature of the deposit. Mrs. Thorne could have been one of the wealthiest people in America if she'd developed this, Chen said, his voice echoing in the deep shaft. Instead, she chose to extract maybe $100,000 worth per year, just enough to test the vein and verify its extent. The discipline that required was remarkable. Why did she do it that way? She told me once that she was more interested in studying human nature than mining gold. She said the gold was her insurance policy, her backup plan if the family ever deserved it, but she never believed they would. Standing in that shaft, surrounded by rock that held unimaginable wealth, Elias understood Martha's wisdom. This much gold would have corrupted anyone. It would have turned the family against each other completely, made the betrayals and calculations that had already occurred seem mild by comparison. By the end of the week, he felt he understood the basic operation. The mine was well run, profitable in its own right from silver extraction, providing good employment for the region. Revealing the gold would change all of that, turning something sustainable into a frenzy. Martha had been right to hide it. The question was whether he should continue hiding it or whether there was some responsible way to develop it. That decision could wait. For now, he had more immediate concerns. He returned to Silver Creek and met with Garrison again, this time to discuss the property rights situation. The attorney laid out the details with legal precision. "Your nephew Raymond owns the surface rights to the homestead, inherited from his father. You own the mineral rights and water rights underneath. Legally, that gives you significant leverage over his operation." "What kind of leverage?" "You could deny him access to water. You could extract minerals beneath his land. You could charge him fees for access roads that cross your property to reach his. Any of these actions would make it impossible for him to farm profitably." Garrison paused. "Or you could do nothing. Let him continue as he has been, unaware of the situation. That feels dishonest. Perhaps, but it's also merciful. The question is whether he deserves mercy after what he did to you." Elias had been wrestling with that question for days. Justice versus mercy, retribution versus forgiveness. Part of him wanted to use his power to teach Raymond a lesson about treating family as disposable burdens. But another part, the part that sounded like Clara, reminded him that becoming vindictive would make him no better than his nephew. "I need to talk to him," Elias decided. Face to face. Before I make any decisions about the property, he needs to know what happened, what he unknowingly did when he threw me out. When do you want to do this? Tomorrow. I've put it off long enough. That night, Elias barely slept. He lay in his hotel room rehearsing the conversation, imagining Raymond's reactions, trying to find the words to convey the situation without gloating or anger. This needed to be done right, with dignity, or it would poison everything that came after. Morning came cold and clear. Elias, dressed carefully in his best clothes, such as they were, and rode Barnaby out of Silver Creek toward the valley where the homestead sat. The journey took most of the day, following trails he'd traveled countless times, each landmark bringing back memories. There was the creek where he and Clara had picnicked in their first summer together. There was the stand of aspens where Michael had fallen from a tree and broken his arm at age 7. There was the overlook where he'd stood the morning after Clara died, trying to understand how to go forward alone. Every mile brought another memory, another piece of the life he'd built and lost, not all at once, but gradually, piece by piece, until Raymond's final betrayal had severed the last connection. By late afternoon, he reached the ridge overlooking the homestead. He stopped there, looking down at the familiar buildings, the fields he'd worked, the barn he'd built. Smoke rose from the main house chimney. Raymond would be inside, warm and comfortable, probably working on his ledgers, calculating profits and losses. Elias nudged Barnaby forward and down the slope toward the homestead. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline mixing with apprehension. This was it. The confrontation he'd been avoiding, the moment when everything would change. He rode into the yard and dismounted, tying Barnaby to the same rail where he'd tied him 12,000 times before. The donkey looked around with familiar eyes, recognizing home even if it wasn't home anymore. Elias climbed the porch, steps, and knocked on the door he'd built with his own hands 35 years ago. Footsteps inside, then the door opened. Raymond stood there, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to shock to something like horror in the space of seconds. "Uncle Elias? You're alive? May I come in?" Raymond stepped back, his face pale. We thought you'd died in the mountains." "I nearly did, but I found shelter." Elias entered the house, noting how Raymond had rearranged things, making the space his own. "We need to talk, Raymond." His nephew recovered some composure, though. His hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the sitting room. "Of course. Can I get you something? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be good." They sat in the sitting room where Elias had spent countless evenings with Clara, where they'd read books and talked about their days and made plans for a future that had turned out so differently than they'd imagined. Raymond poured coffee with shaking hands, clearly trying to process Elias's unexpected appearance. "Where have you been?" Raymond asked finally. "Great-Aunt Martha's property. You remember her? The one the family declared dead, whose estate you assumed was worthless." "I remember the stories, but that was just family legend, I thought. No one knew if she was even real." "She was real, and her property wasn't a rotting shack like everyone believed." Elias sipped his coffee, watching his nephew's face. "It's a mansion, Raymond. Beautiful, well-maintained, worth a fortune by itself. But that's not the interesting part." Raymond's eyes were wide now, calculating, probably already trying to figure out if there was an angle he could work. "Martha died 3 days before I arrived. She left a will with specific conditions. Everything went to whichever family member showed kindness enough to visit her before the spring thaw." "Elias, let that sink in. By throwing me out into the winter, by forcing me to seek shelter in the mountains, you sent me to claim an inheritance worth more than you've ever imagined." "What inheritance? What are you talking about?" Elias pulled documents from his coat and laid them on the table between them. "Martha owned the Silver Peak mine, the largest silver operation in 3 counties. She also owned extensive land rights throughout this valley and beyond." He watched the blood drain from Raymond's face as understanding dawned. "Including," Elias continued quietly, "the mineral and water rights underneath this homestead. You own the surface, Raymond. I own everything beneath it and everything that flows through it." His nephew stared at the documents like they might be snakes. "That's not possible. Dad owned this land free and clear. Your father owned surface rights. He sold the mineral and water rights 20 years ago to pay off debts. Martha bought them through intermediaries. He never knew it was her. This is some kind of trick, some scheme, too. It's all legal and documented. You can verify it with Howard Garrison in Silver Creek. He's been Martha's attorney for 30 years. Elias leaned forward. "You threw me out, calling me a useless mouth, Raymond. You calculated my worth in purely economic terms and found me worthless. And by doing that, you handed me control over everything you thought was yours." Raymond stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his back to Elias. When he spoke, his voice was tight, with barely controlled emotion. "So you've come to gloat? To throw me out the way I threw you out?" "No, I've come to give you a choice." His nephew turned, surprise showing through the fear and anger on his face. "I don't want revenge, Raymond. It wouldn't bring back what you took from me, and it wouldn't make me feel any better. But you need to understand what you did, why it was wrong, and what kind of man you want to be going forward." "What choice?" Raymond's voice was barely above a whisper. Elias pulled out another document, one he'd had Garrison draw up. "You can continue farming this land. I'll lease you the rights you need, water and access, at fair rates. You'll pay what anyone else would pay, no more and no less. And you'll acknowledge that you made a mistake, that family deserves better treatment than economic calculation. And if I don't, then I exercise my legal rights to deny you access to water and mineral resources. The homestead becomes worthless to you. You lose everything, just as you were willing to let me lose everything." Raymond sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes that might have been genuine or might have been calculated. With Raymond, it was hard to tell. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought I was trying to save the operation. The debts Dad left, the hard winter coming. I thought I was making a smart business decision. You were making a decision that treated me like a problem to be eliminated rather than a person to be valued. That's what you need to understand, Raymond. People aren't numbers in a ledger. Family isn't a balance sheet." His nephew nodded slowly, broken or pretending to be broken. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to sign this lease agreement. I want you to acknowledge in writing what happened and what you did wrong. And then I want you to live with that knowledge and be better." Raymond took the document with shaking hands, reading through it slowly. The terms were fair, even generous, but they made clear that Elias held the power now, that Raymond's continued prosperity depended on his uncle's mercy. "If I sign this, we're square. No more surprises? Sign it and farm honestly, and you'll have no problems from me. But understand, Raymond, I'll be watching. This is your one chance to prove you're better than what you showed me when you threw me out." His nephew found a pen, hesitated one final moment, then signed the agreement with a hand that shook so badly the signature was barely legible. When he finished, he looked up at Elias with eyes that held fear and resentment, and perhaps the smallest hint of grudging respect. "You're a better man than I am, Uncle. I'm just a man who remembers what matters. Try to do the same." Elias stood, taking the signed document and folding it carefully into his coat. He'd accomplished what he came for. Raymond knew the truth now, knew the consequences of his choices, knew he lived on borrowed mercy. What Raymond did with that knowledge would determine whether he was redeemable or whether Elias had wasted mercy on someone incapable of learning from it. Time would tell. It always did. 3 months passed, and spring came to the mountains with all its sudden intensity. Snow melted, creeks ran high with runoff, and green returned to the valleys like a promise kept. Elias divided his time between the mansion, the mine, and occasional visits to Silver Creek to meet with Garrison on business matters that seemed to multiply, despite his best efforts to keep things simple. The mine operation continued as it had under Martha's management. Silver extraction remained profitable, the workers stayed employed at fair wages, and the secret of the gold remained known only to the few trusted individuals. Elias had decided, at least for now, to follow Martha's wisdom and leave the deeper wealth untouched. Raymond had made his lease payments on time, farming the homestead with what appeared to be honest effort. Whether that represented genuine change or simply calculation that his best option was compliance, Elias couldn't say. They'd had no direct contact since their confrontation, communicating only through Garrison's office when necessary. The situation felt stable but unfinished, like a story paused rather than concluded. Then one morning, Sullivan rode up to the mansion with news that would force Elias to make the decisions he'd been postponing. "We have a problem," the foreman said without preamble. Accepting the coffee Elias offered, "A mining company out of Denver has filed claims on land adjacent to our operation. They're planning exploratory drilling." "Is that unusual?" "Not usually, but their surveyor has been asking very specific questions about our deeper shafts, questions that suggest they know or suspect something about what we found in Shaft 7. Elias felt cold wash through him. How would they know? "I don't know, but someone talked or someone did research or someone put pieces together." Sullivan pulled out a document. "They've filed a formal development proposal with the territorial government. If approved, they'll begin operations within 6 months." Elias read through the proposal. The language was technical, but the intent was clear. The company planned extensive exploration of the canyon system, using modern drilling techniques to map underground deposits. If they went forward, they would almost certainly discover the gold vein, and once discovered, the secret would be impossible to maintain. "What are our options?" "We can contest their claims, argue they're too close to our operation. That might delay them but won't stop them permanently. We can try to buy them out, but that would require revealing why we care so much about keeping them away, which defeats the purpose. Or we can move first, file our own development plan for the gold, and establish clear ownership before they get close enough to matter, which would mean revealing what Martha kept secret for 15 years. Yes, but the secret's about to come out anyway, one way or another. At least if we control the revelation, we can shape how it's developed." Elias walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where Martha was buried. She'd trusted him to make this decision, to determine whether the gold should stay hidden or be brought into the light. He'd thought he'd have more time, but time had just run out. What would development look like? Sullivan spread maps across the dining table, showing proposed shaft expansions, processing facilities, infrastructure improvements. Done right, it could employ 500 people within 5 years. Done wrong, it becomes a destructive frenzy that tears apart the canyon and destroys what we've built. And there's no way to keep it hidden now, not once they start drilling nearby. The geological signs will lead them right to it. Better they find out we already own it and are developing it responsibly than have them discover it independently and start a rush. Elias studied the maps, his mind working through implications. More workers meant more families supported, more prosperity for Silver Creek and surrounding towns, but it also meant the quiet operation Martha had built would transform into something much larger and less controllable. How long do I have to decide? The Denver company's proposal goes before the Territorial Review Board in 6 weeks. If we're going to contest it or file our own development plan, we need to start the process now. 6 weeks to decide the future of something Martha had carefully protected for 15 years. 6 weeks to determine whether he would be the man who unleashed the gold or the man who continued hiding it, until external forces made the choice for him. "I need to think about this. Give me a few days." Sullivan nodded, gathering his maps. "For what it's worth, I think Martha knew this moment would come. She couldn't hide the gold forever. What she could do was make sure it ended up in the hands of someone who would think carefully about what to do with it, rather than just rushing to extract every ounce." After Sullivan left, Elias sat alone in the mansion's study, surrounded by Martha's books and papers. Her presence felt strong here, as if her ghost watched to see what he would decide. He pulled out her journal and read through the entries again, looking for guidance. One passage near the end caught his attention. "The gold is a test within the test. I hid it not because I feared it, but because I wanted to see if my heir would be wise enough to understand that not all wealth should be pursued. Not all opportunities should be seized. Sometimes the right choice is to leave things buried, but sometimes the right choice is to bring them into the light with wisdom and care. May whoever inherits have the judgment to know the difference." The problem was, Elias still wasn't sure which choice was right. The answer came 3 days later from an unexpected source. Elias was at the mine, talking with Chen about geological surveys, when Sullivan approached with a group of workers, about 20 men, representing the various shifts and roles in the operation. Their spokesman was Tom Fletcher, a veteran miner in his 40s who'd worked at Silver Peak for 18 years. "Mr. Thorne, could we have a word?" Fletcher asked, his hat in his hands. Of course. The men gathered in the main office, filling it with their presence. Fletcher pulled out a piece of paper covered in signatures, dozens of them. He laid it on Sullivan's desk. "We've heard rumors about the Denver company, about them trying to move in on claims near ours. We wanted you to know that we're loyal to this operation. Mrs. Thorne treated us fair for all the years she ran things, and you've done the same since you took over. Whatever happens with those outside folks, we're with you." Elias picked up the petition, reading through the signatures. Almost every worker at the mine had signed, adding short notes beside their names. "Good work here, fair wages, honest operation, best job I've had." "I appreciate this," Elias said, "but I want to be straight with you all. There's something you should know, something that might affect what happens next." He glanced at Sullivan, who nodded slightly. This was it, the moment of revelation. "The silver operation here is profitable and sustainable. You all know that. What you don't know is that 15 years ago, Mrs. Thorne discovered something else in the deeper shafts. Gold, a substantial amount of it. She kept it secret, extracting only small amounts because she wanted to protect the operation from becoming a destructive gold rush." The men exchanged glances, surprise and calculation showing on various faces. Fletcher spoke for them. "How substantial are we talking?" "Enough to employ 5 times as many men. Enough to make Silver Creek one of the most important mining towns in the territory. Enough to change everything." "And you've been sitting on it?" someone asked from the back. "Mrs. Thorne was sitting on it. I inherited the knowledge along with everything else. And now I have to decide whether to keep it hidden or develop it, because the Denver company's activities are going to expose it one way or another." The room fell silent. Elias could see the men processing this information, weighing what it meant for them, for their families, for the future. "Here's what I need you to understand," Elias continued. "If we develop the gold, this place changes. It gets bigger, louder, harder to plan. Control. More people means more complications, more risk of accidents, more pressure to maximize extraction at the expense of safety and wages." Mrs. Thorne kept it hidden because she'd seen what gold does to operations and people. "It makes them reckless. But it also means more jobs," Fletcher said. "More opportunity for our kids, for the town." "Yes, it could mean that, if it's done right. If we don't let it turn into a frenzy." Another miner, older, spoke up. "My son's looking for work. Can't find anything decent. If there were jobs here, good jobs like we have, he could stay instead of heading to the city. That matters to me." Others nodded. The tension in the room shifted, men beginning to see possibilities. "So, what we're asking," Fletcher said carefully, "is what do you plan to do? Because if you're going to develop it, we want to be part of that. We want good jobs for ourselves and our families. But if you're going to keep it hidden, we need to know that too, so we can plan accordingly." It was a fair question, and Elias appreciated the directness. These men had lives and families depending on his decisions. They deserved honesty. "I'm going to develop it," he said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. "But we're going to do it Martha's way, carefully, sustainably, with fair wages and safe conditions. We're going to expand, but we're not going to rush. Quality over quantity. People over pure profit." The relief in the room was palpable. Men who'd been tense relaxed slightly, allowing themselves to hope for better futures. "We'll need experienced men to train new hires," Sullivan added. "People who understand how we do things here, who can teach the right way versus the fast way. You all would be those trainers, with pay increases to match the additional responsibility." Now the men were smiling, shaking hands, talking among themselves about possibilities. Fletcher approached Elias directly. "Thank you for being straight with us. Mrs. Thorne was a good owner because she cared about more than just the profit. Sounds like you're cut from the same cloth." "I'm trying to be." After the workers left, energized and talking excitedly, Sullivan turned to Elias. "So we're doing this. We're developing the gold. We're doing it, but we're doing it right. I want you to work with Chen and Garrison to develop a plan that prioritizes safety and sustainability. I want fair wages written into every contract, and I want a portion of profits set aside for town improvements, schools, medical facilities, things that benefit everyone. That's going to cut into potential returns. I don't care. Martha gave me a fortune I asked for. The least I can do is use it to help people rather than just accumulating more wealth I don't need." Sullivan smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Elias had seen from the usually stern foreman. "She chose well. I think you understand exactly what she was trying to teach." Outside the office window, the mine continued its operations, men working the silver deposits that had sustained them for years. Soon they'd be working something much more valuable, but if Elias had his way, the essential character of the operation wouldn't change. Fair work for fair pay, dignity, and safety over maximum extraction. It was what Martha would have wanted. It was what Clara would have approved of. And it was, Elias realized, exactly what he wanted too. 1 year later, Elias stood on the porch of Martha's mansion, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The irony of that particular color wasn't lost on him. Gold had transformed his life, but not in the ways people might expect. The mine expansion was proceeding carefully, exactly as planned. New shafts had been sunk, processing facilities constructed, and employment had tripled. Silver Creek had grown substantially, with new houses, a proper school, and a medical clinic that served the entire region. The expansion had brought prosperity, but it had been managed prosperity, growth that didn't destroy what had existed before. Elias had kept his promises to the workers: fair wages, safe conditions, and profit-sharing arrangements that meant everyone benefited from the mine's success. It had cost him potential wealth, but he slept better at night, knowing that families were secure, that children had futures, that the operation built things rather than just extracting them. The Denver company had initially contested his development claims, but Garrison's legal work had been thorough and their challenges had failed. Eventually, they'd given up and moved their operations elsewhere. The gold was secure, its development proceeding at a pace that felt sustainable rather than frantic. Barnaby wandered over from where he'd been grazing, his grey muzzle showing his age but his eyes still bright. Elias stroked the donkey's neck, feeling the familiar warmth of his coat, the solid presence that had been constant through all the changes. "We've come a long way, haven't we, old friend?" he said softly. The donkey huffed in what might have been agreement. Across Barnaby's back lay the faded red saddle blanket, worn thin now but still serviceable. Clara's handiwork, still keeping them both warm after all these years. Elias ran his hand across it, feeling the texture of her stitches, remembering her hands creating something practical and beautiful all at once. He thought about her often, wondering what she'd make of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the inheritance, the choices he'd made. He liked to think she'd approve, that she'd see in his decisions the values they'd shared during their years together. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention. A rider was approaching, someone Elias recognized even at a distance, Raymond, on a visit that had become monthly over the past year. His nephew had changed, or appeared to have changed. He farmed the homestead honestly, made his lease payments without complaint, and had begun tentatively rebuilding their relationship. Whether the change was genuine or pragmatic remained unclear, but Elias had decided to accept the effort at face value and see where it led. Raymond dismounted and climbed the porch steps. He was thinner than before, the soft edges of easy living replaced by the lean look of someone who worked his own land. "Uncle Elias." "Raymond, coffee? That would be good." They sat on the porch with their cups, looking out at the view as evening deepened. This had become their ritual, monthly visits where they talked about the farms, the weather, the mine, carefully rebuilding what had been broken. "I heard the expansion is going well," Raymond said. "It is. We'll be at full production within 6 months. Must be satisfying. Building something that helps so many people." Elias glanced at his nephew, searching for sarcasm, but Raymond's expression seemed genuine. "It is. More satisfying than just accumulating wealth would have been." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Raymond spoke again, his voice quiet. "I've been thinking about Dad, about how he struggled with debts and never told anyone, never asked for help. I understand that better now. Pride is expensive. So is cruelty." "Yes." Raymond set down his cup. "I know I can't undo what I did, throwing you out, calling you worthless. I was wrong, and no amount of apology changes that. But I want you to know I think about it every day. It's a weight I carry." Elias studied his nephew's face, seeing genuine regret there, or something close to it. "We all carry weights, Raymond. The question is what we do with them. Do we let them crush us, or do we use them to build something better? I'm trying to build something better. The farm, my life, how I treat people. It's harder than I expected. Good things usually are." They finished their coffee as stars began to appear. Before leaving, Raymond hesitated. Would you consider coming to dinner sometime at the homestead? I know it holds painful memories, but I'd like to share a meal, if you're willing." Elias considered this. Going back to the house he'd built with Clara, where he'd been thrown out, where so much had been lost, it would be difficult. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps some things needed to be faced rather than avoided. "I'll come next month, when I'm back from meeting with the territorial governor about expansion permits." Relief washed over Raymond's face. "Thank you. I'll make it worth your while." After his nephew left, Elias remained on the porch as full darkness fell. The mansion behind him was warm and comfortable, filled with books and memories of Martha's long life. The mine below employed hundreds, providing security and futures. The land stretched in all directions, beautiful and productive under his stewardship. He'd been cast out, with nothing, and had found everything. Not through his own doing, but through a strange twist of fate and an old woman's test that he'd passed without knowing he was being tested. Martha had given him power, and he'd chosen to use it for building rather than destroying, for mercy rather than revenge. Was he happy? The question felt too simple for what he felt. Content, perhaps, purposeful, connected to something larger than himself. He missed Clara every day, missed the simple life they'd built together, but he'd honored her memory by staying the man she'd loved, by not letting wealth corrupt what she'd valued in him. He thought about the cameo locket, now in a place of honor in the study. Martha and James frozen in time, their love preserved in miniature. His own love for Clara lived in the red blanket still warming Barnaby's back, in the decisions he made, in the man he chose to be each day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove himself worthy or unworthy of what he'd been given. But tonight, standing on this porch with mountains silhouetted against stars, he felt at peace with the journey that had brought him here. He'd been thrown away and found himself. He'd been tested and passed. He'd been given power and chosen wisdom. And in the end, that was Martha's real gift, not the gold or the land or the wealth, but the chance to discover who he truly was when everything else was stripped away. He was Elias Thorne, old, bones, a cowboy who'd become a mine owner, a cast-out who'd become a keeper of fortunes, a man who'd learned that the greatest wealth was in staying true to yourself when you had every reason and opportunity to become someone else. The mountains stood eternal around him, witnesses to his transformation, silent in their approval or judgment. And beneath those mountains, in darkness few people would ever see, lay enough gold to buy anything in the world except the things that actually mattered. He understood that now. Martha had understood it her whole life, and in understanding it, in choosing people over profit and mercy, over revenge, he'd finally, truly, claimed the inheritance she'd meant to leave him all along.